If you ever see your face on a news headline next to your CEO, just know, your life is already over. That was the first thought that hit me as microphones were shoved inches from my mouth. Camera flashes popping like a storm I couldn't step out of. My name echoing from strangers who suddenly knew me better than I knew myself. Ethan Brooks. How long have you been dating Nathan Cole? Dating. Right. I almost laughed, except my throat was too tight, my pulse too loud, and somewhere behind the chaos stood the man who caused all of this. Calm as ever. Watching me like this was just another meeting he had scheduled between lunch and ruining someone's life, which apparently was me, because less than 12 hours ago, I was just a junior analyst worrying about rent, reheating leftover pasta at midnight, and trying not to make eye contact with the CEO in elevators like a normal person with survival instincts. And now I was allegedly his secret boyfriend, plastered across every screen in the country, trending for reasons I did not consent to. And the worst part is, this didn't even start as a misunderstanding. No, it started with a decision, his decision, because last night at a charity gala I didn't belong at, wearing a suit that fit like it was apologizing for existing. I got too close to something I shouldn't have, too close to him, to the tension in the room, to the whispers about his reputation cracking under pressure, and before I could back away, before I could pretend I didn't hear anything, he turned, locked eyes with me like he had already calculated 10 steps ahead, and walked straight over. And I remember thinking this was it. I was getting fired for breathing wrong in his presence, but instead he said, soft enough that no one else could hear, "Don't move." And then his hand was on my waist, steady, firm, like I was something he had already claimed, and before my brain could catch up, before I could even process the fact that Nathan Cole was touching me in public, he leaned in and kissed me. Not rushed, not desperate, but precise, controlled, like he was signing a contract with his lips. And the room shifted, conversations died, cameras turned, and just like that, I became part of his story, except I didn't know the script, I didn't agree to the role. And now, standing here with reporters shouting questions I can't answer, I finally understand something terrifyingly clear. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't panic. This was strategy. And when my gaze finds his again through the crowd, his expression unreadable, composed, like none of this is spiraling out of control, I realize the worst part isn't that he used me. It's that somewhere between that moment and now, I'm starting to wonder why me. And whether the answer is something I'm not ready to hear. I should have run the moment he touched me. But instead I stood there like someone who had just been rewritten mid-sentence, and now I was paying for it in real time, as security finally pushed the reporters back and a firm hand closed around my wrist again. Not rough, not urgent, just certain. And I did not even have to look to know it was him, because no one else in this city moved like they already owned every room they stepped into. And suddenly I was being guided through a private exit, away from the noise, away from the flashing lights, straight into the back of a sleek black car that probably cost more than my yearly salary. And the door shut with a soft click that sounded final in a way I did not like, because the silence inside was immediate, heavy, and filled with everything I did not understand. And for a few seconds neither of us spoke, which somehow felt worse than the chaos outside, until I finally turned to him and said the only thing my brain could hold on to. What was that? And he did not look surprised, did not look apologetic. He just adjusted the cuff of his sleeve like we had just finished a normal conversation instead of detonating my entire life. It was necessary, he said, voice even, controlled, like he was discussing quarterly projections, and I laughed, because that word did not belong anywhere near what just happened. Necessary does not usually involve kissing your employee in front of half the media industry. Necessary does not trend online in under 10 minutes. Necessary definitely does not ruin someone's life who did not sign up for it. But he just watched me, steady, assessing, like my reaction was another variable he had already accounted for. And then he said it, simple, direct. "You're going to help me fix this." And something in my chest tightened because that was not a request. That was a conclusion. I am not doing anything. I shot back immediately because I needed to hear myself say it, needed to believe I still had control over something, anything. But his gaze did not shift, did not soften. It just settled on me with that same quiet pressure that made people fold without him raising his voice. "You already are," he replied. And then he reached into the leather folder beside him and pulled out a document. placing it on the seat between us like it had always been there waiting. Like this moment had been scheduled long before I walked into it. And I stared at the first line, my name printed clean, precise, official. And for a second my brain refused to process it, refused to accept that this was not improvisation. This was not damage control on the fly. This was something built, prepared, intentional. You planned this, I said, the words coming out quieter than I expected. And that was when something flickered in his expression. Not guilt, not hesitation, just a brief acknowledgement that landed harder than any apology could have. I plan everything, he said, and I did not know if that made me safer or completely ruined. Because as the city lights blurred past the window and my phone kept vibrating with notifications I was too afraid to check, one thought settled in, cold and sharp. This was not about a single kiss. This was not about a single night. This was a move on a board I did not even know I was part of. And somehow, I had already been placed exactly where he wanted me. I should have stopped reading after the first page, but I did not, because something about seeing my name printed in clean, deliberate lines made it impossible to look away, like I was staring at a version of my life that had already been decided without me. And the deeper I went, the worse it got. Clauses about public appearances, behavioral expectations, shared statements, even something about coordinated schedules that aligned perfectly with events I had never agreed to attend. And every sentence felt like another quiet confirmation that this was not chaos. This was architecture, and I was standing in the middle of it without a map. You cannot be serious, I said, but my voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else, someone who had not just realized they were replaceable in their own story. Nathan did not interrupt, did not rush me. He just let the silence stretch until it tightened around the space between us. Then he spoke, measured, calm. This will stabilize the narrative within 48 hours, his tone making it sound like the outcome was already guaranteed, like people were not involved, like emotions did not exist, just results. And I shook my head because I needed to push back, needed to create some kind of friction in a situation that was moving too smoothly, too precisely. You do not get to decide that, I said. I am not part of your company. I am not part of your damage control. I am not part of whatever this is. And for a moment I thought that would be enough, that saying it out loud would anchor me. But then he leaned slightly closer, not invading, not aggressive, just enough that I could feel the shift, the gravity of his attention settling fully on me. And when he spoke again, his voice dropped just enough to cut through everything else. You already are, Ethan. And hearing my name like that did something I could not explain, not fear, not exactly, but something sharper, something that made it harder to hold on to the certainty I was trying to build, because the truth was, he was right. The headlines were already out, the photos already circulating, the story already forming without my input, and walking away now would not undo any of it. It would just leave me alone in the fallout. And he knew that. Of course he knew that, because he planned everything. So what happens if I say no? I asked, forcing the question out before I could second guess it. And this time he did pause, not long, just enough to acknowledge that this was the one variable he could not fully control. Then he answered, not threatening, not cold, just honest in a way that made it worse. Then the narrative continues without you, and I do not think you will like where it goes. And there it was, not a threat, not really, just a statement of probability, a future laid out in the same calm tone he used for everything else. And I hated how logical it sounded, how inevitable, because as much as I wanted to reject it, to push the contract back and walk out of the car like I still had that kind of freedom, my phone buzzed again in my pocket, relentless, insistent, reminding me that the world outside had already moved on from giving me a choice. And when I finally looked back down at the document, at the place where my signature was supposed to go, I realized something that made my stomach drop in a way no headline could. This was not about agreeing to something new. This was about catching up to something that had already started. And when I lifted my eyes to meet his again, searching for any sign that this could still be stopped, all I found was quiet certainty, like he had been waiting for me to reach this exact point all along. And somehow, that felt like the real beginning of whatever this was. My hand hovered over the signature line longer than it should have. Like the pen itself understood that once it touched paper there would be no clean way back, no simple undo, just consequences stacked neatly behind a decision I was not ready to make. And I hated that he was not rushing me, Hated that he just sat there across from me with that same impossible patience, as if he knew exactly how long it would take for logic to win over resistance. Because that was what this was, not persuasion, not manipulation in the obvious sense, just a quiet narrowing of options until there was only one path that made sense, and I could feel it happening in real time, my arguments shrinking, my certainty thinning out with every second that passed. This is insane, I muttered, more to myself than to him. But he still heard it. Of course he did, because nothing seemed to get past him. And when he responded, his voice was softer than before, not gentle, but less sharp around the edges. You are not wrong, which somehow made it worse, because I expected him to deny it, expected him to frame this as reasonable, necessary, something clean and corporate, but instead he acknowledged the truth of it. And that honesty landed heavier than any lie could have. So why me? I asked again, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because it mattered, because out of all the people he could have chosen, all the polished, media-trained, socially acceptable options, he picked me, someone who still double-checked his bank balance before ordering takeout, someone who avoided eye contact in elevators, someone who did not belong in his world. And for a moment I thought he might deflect, might give me another strategic answer, but instead he held my gaze, steady, unflinching, and said, "Because you are believable." And I blinked, caught off guard by how simple it sounded, how brutally practical. Believable, I repeated, and he nodded once. Like that was explanation enough, like that was the only metric that mattered. And maybe it was. Maybe in his world authenticity was just another asset to deploy, something to use when needed, something to position carefully in front of cameras and headlines. But something about the way he said it lingered, something that did not feel entirely calculated. And I did not like that. Did not like the way it made this feel less like a transaction and more like something I could not define. You are asking me to lie to the entire world, I said, trying to pull the conversation back to something solid, something I could hold on to. And he shook his head slightly. No, he corrected. I am asking you to let them believe what they already want to believe, and that distinction should not have mattered. But it did. It shifted something small and dangerous in the space between us. Because he was not creating the story, he was guiding it, shaping it. And somehow that felt even more unsettling. The car slowed as we pulled up in front of a building I recognized immediately. His building, glass and steel rising into the night like it had never known uncertainty. And before I could fully process the shift, the driver stepped out. The door opened, and cool air rushed in, breaking the fragile bubble of the conversation. "We will finalize everything upstairs," Nathan said as he stepped out first, offering nothing more, no reassurance, no pressure, just expectation. And I sat there for a second longer, staring at the contract still resting on the seat beside me, my name waiting at the bottom like it had always been meant to be there. And I realized something I could not ignore anymore. This was not about whether I trusted him. It was about whether I could survive what happened if I did not. And as I finally stepped out of the car and followed him toward the entrance, the city lights reflecting off the glass around us, I understood that whatever line I had been standing on before was already behind me. And the only question left was how far I was willing to go once I crossed it. I did not remember deciding to follow him. But somehow I was already inside. The lobby swallowing me whole with polished marble floors and soft lighting that made everything feel unreal, like I had stepped into a version of my life that had been edited for impact, not accuracy, and Nathan moved through it like he belonged to every inch of it, every glance from the staff confirming what I already knew. This was his domain, his rules, his world, and I was just trying not to look like I had been dragged into it against my will, which I had. But that did not matter here. Nothing about how I felt seemed to matter here. The elevator ride was silent, too quiet, the kind of silence that forces you to hear your own thoughts whether you want to or not, and mine were loud, chaotic, circling the same question over and over again. What happens after I sign? Not if, after, because somewhere between the car and now I had already crossed that line in my head, already accepted that walking away was not as simple as it sounded. The doors opened to a private floor, and I stepped out into a space that felt more like a controlled environment than an office. Glass walls, clean lines, everything placed exactly where it was supposed to be, just like him, just like this entire situation. And before I could fully take it in, he was already moving again, setting the contract down on a desk that looked like it had never seen clutter, never seen hesitation. Sit, he said, not harsh, not commanding. But it was not a suggestion either, and I obeyed before I could question it, which irritated me more than anything else, because I was not supposed to be this easy to direct, not supposed to fall into step just because he expected it. And yet here I was, pen in hand again, staring at the same empty line. You are quiet, he noted, standing across from me, his gaze steady in that way that made it impossible to pretend he was not watching every detail. I am thinking, I replied, and he gave a small nod, like that was acceptable, like he had already accounted for that too. So think faster, because the press conference is in 2 hours, and that snapped something into place. 2 hours. That was all the time I had left before this became official, before this turned from speculation into confirmation, before my face and his name became something permanent in the public eye. You are announcing this, I said, disbelief creeping in despite everything. And he tilted his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the question. We are, he corrected, and the way he said it made it sound like a partnership, like I had already agreed, like my hesitation was just a formality he was allowing me to work through. And I hated how effective that was, how it shifted the weight of the decision, made it feel shared even when it was not. I looked back down at the contract, at the terms that now felt less like options and more like instructions, and for a moment I tried to imagine what my life would look like in 24 hours, in a week, in a month, tried to picture myself standing beside him in front of cameras, answering questions with answers that were not entirely true, holding on to a role that was never supposed to be mine, and the image did not feel real, but neither did anything else about today. So maybe that was the point. Maybe reality had already shifted, and I was the last one catching up. My grip on the pen tightened, the decision pressing in from all sides. And then, before I could give myself time to rethink it again, I signed, the motion quick, almost automatic, like my hand understood something my mind was still trying to process. And the second the pen left the paper, the room felt different, heavier, like something had locked into place, like there was no longer a version of this where I walked away untouched. Nathan glanced down at the signature, just once. And for the first time since this started, I saw something change. Not relief, not satisfaction, something quieter, harder to read, like a calculation had just been confirmed. Then he looked back at me and said, calmly, almost softly, welcome to the narrative. And I realized too late that I had not just agreed to play a part. I had stepped into something that was already moving, already building, and now there was no separating myself from it. No clear line between what was real and what was not. Only the understanding that in less than 2 hours, the entire world was going to believe a story that started with a lie. And I was the one who had just made it official the moment the contract left my hand. Everything accelerated like I had stepped onto a moving walkway I could not get off. And Nathan was already in motion, already shifting from strategist to execution mode with a precision that made my head spin. He picked up his phone, gave 2 short instructions I could not fully process. And within seconds, the quiet office filled with people who moved like they had rehearsed this moment, stylists, assistants, someone with a tablet already listing out talking points, and I just sat there for a second, watching it unfold, realizing that this was not something being built now. This had been ready, waiting. All it needed was my signature to activate. Ethan, we need to adjust your look, a woman said as she approached, her tone efficient but not unkind, and I blinked at her, because I had not even had time to think about what I was wearing, about how I looked, about how I would be seen. And suddenly that mattered more than anything, because the version of me that walked into that press conference would not just be me anymore. It would be a narrative, a statement, a confirmation. I stood up slowly, letting them guide me without resistance, because resisting felt pointless now, like trying to stop a tide that had already come in. And as they adjusted my jacket, fixed my hair, corrected small details I had never paid attention to before, I caught my reflection in the glass wall and barely recognized the person looking back. It was still me, technically, but sharper, cleaner, curated, like someone had taken the rough edges and filed them down until they fit into his world. And that realization sat heavy in my chest, because I did not know if I was still in control of that image or if it already belonged to him too. You will stand on my left. Nathan's voice cut through the noise, steady, grounding in a way I did not expect, and I turned toward him instinctively, drawn by the certainty in his tone. "You do not need to say much," he continued. "Just enough to support the narrative." I almost laughed at that. Support the narrative. Like it was something external, something separate from us. But I nodded anyway, because what else was I supposed to do? Argue now, back out. When everything was already in motion. And then he stepped closer, not enough to draw attention, just enough that his presence felt more immediate, more focused, and for a brief second the room seemed to quiet around us. His gaze meeting mine with that same intensity that had pulled me into this in the first place. "Do not overthink it," he said, and I wanted to tell him that was impossible. That overthinking was the only thing keeping me from completely losing control of the situation. But the words did not come, because something about the way he said it, calm, assured, made it sound like he believed I could handle this, like he had already decided I would. And that expectation settled into me before I could reject it. The assistant signaled from the doorway, 5 minutes. And just like that the countdown began, my heart picking up pace in response, every second louder than the last. I could hear the faint murmur of voices outside, the press already gathered, already waiting for confirmation, for clarity, for something they could turn into headlines within seconds. And I realized with a sharp, sinking clarity that once I stepped out there would be no separation between me and the story anymore. No clean distinction between truth and performance, only perception. And perception was something Nathan controlled with terrifying ease. "Ready?" he asked, and I almost said no. Almost admitted that I was not ready, that I did not understand what I had just signed myself into, that I was still trying to catch up to a decision I had already made, but instead I nodded. Because somewhere along the way I had stopped asking whether I could do this, and started asking whether I had any other choice. And as the doors opened and the noise rushed in, louder than before, sharper, filled with anticipation, I stepped forward beside him, aware of every movement, every breath, every glance that would now be interpreted, analyzed, turned into something larger than the moment itself. And when his hand found mine, steady, deliberate, not tight but certain, I felt the final piece click into place, not just for them, but for me too, because in that instant, standing in front of a crowd that already believed in something that was never supposed to be real, I understood that whatever this started as, it was no longer just his plan. It was something I was now fully inside, and I had no idea how far it was going to go. The noise hit harder this time. Not just loud but focused, like every voice in the room had locked onto us the second we stepped into view, questions flying in rapid bursts, cameras flashing so fast it felt like the air itself was stuttering. And for a split second my instincts screamed at me to pull away, to step back, to break whatever illusion this was before it fully formed. But his hand tightened just slightly around mine, not enough to restrain, just enough to anchor, and that small pressure did something unexpected. It steadied me, not because I trusted him, but because he was completely unshaken, and that certainty was contagious in the most dangerous way. Nathan did not rush, did not react to the chaos. He simply walked us forward, positioning us exactly where he wanted. And when he finally spoke, the room shifted, voices dropping, attention narrowing, his tone calm, deliberate, carrying without effort. "Thank you for coming," he began, and just like that the narrative started to take shape, not through force, but through control, through pacing, through the way he chose each word like it mattered more than the next. And I stood beside him, hyper-aware of everything, the heat of the lights, the weight of their attention, the way my pulse refused to settle, until I felt it again, his thumb brushing lightly against the side of my hand. A small movement, almost invisible, but it grounded me in a way I did not expect, like a reminder that I was part of this moment, not just trapped inside it. And when the first direct question came, sharp and unavoidable, "How long have you two been together?" I felt every muscle in my body tense, because this was it. This was where the lie had to become real, where hesitation would unravel everything. And I could feel the silence stretching, waiting, pressing, but before I could overthink it, before I could second-guess every possible answer, Nathan turned slightly toward me, not fully, just enough that his presence shifted closer. And in that moment something clicked, not logic, not strategy, something instinctive, and I heard my own voice respond, steady, clearer than I expected, long enough, and it was simple, vague, impossible to fact-check. Exactly what this situation needed. And the reaction was immediate, a ripple through the crowd. Pins moving faster, cameras adjusting. The story solidifying in real time. And I realized with a jolt that I had just crossed another line. Without even feeling it happen, I had contributed, not just followed, not just reacted. I had actively reinforced the narrative. And that realization should have scared me more than it did. But instead there was something else underneath it. Something quieter, something that felt dangerously close to control, like maybe I was not as powerless in this as I thought. The questions kept coming, sharper now, more invasive. But Nathan handled them with the same precision, redirecting when necessary, confirming just enough to keep them satisfied, never giving more than he intended. And all the while I stayed beside him, responding when needed, mirroring his pace, adjusting without being told, until it almost felt natural, almost felt real. And that was the part that unsettled me the most. Because somewhere between the first question and now, the performance had stopped feeling like a performance. It had started to blur into something else, something I could not clearly separate from reality. And when the press conference finally ended, when the noise began to fade and the crowd dispersed, I expected the tension to break. Expected the moment to dissolve the second we were out of sight, but it did not. Because as we stepped back into the quiet hallway, his hand did not drop immediately. It lingered for a second longer than necessary, and when it finally did, the absence of it felt more noticeable than the touch itself. And that was when it hit me, not the headlines, not the cameras, not even the contract, but this subtle shift in something I could not define. Because for the first time since all of this started, I was not just reacting to his plan, I was starting to exist inside it. And I did not know if that made me safer or more exposed than before. The silence after the press conference did not feel like relief. It felt like the kind of quiet that comes after something irreversible, the kind that forces you to sit with what just happened instead of running from it. And I followed him down the hallway without saying anything at first, because I was still catching up to myself, still replaying every second in my head. The way I answered without hesitation, the way it felt. Almost natural to stand beside him, to match his pace, to become part of the image everyone had already accepted. And that realization sat heavier than the cameras ever did, because it was not just about what they believed anymore. It was about what I had started to accept without questioning. "You handled that well," Nathan said finally, his tone even. But there was something under it, something quieter, almost like approval, and I stopped walking for half a second because that caught me off guard more than anything else today. Not the chaos, not the contract, but that simple acknowledgement. I was not trying to handle it well, I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. I was trying not to make it worse. And he looked at me then. Really looked, not the surface-level assessment he had been doing all day, but something more focused, more direct, and for a moment the space between us shifted again, subtle but undeniable. "You did both," he said, and the certainty in his voice made it difficult to dismiss, like he was stating a fact rather than offering reassurance, and I did not know what to do with that. Because this was not supposed to feel like success. This was supposed to feel like damage control, like survival. But instead there was something else threading through it, something that felt dangerously close to alignment, like I was starting to move in sync with him without realizing it. My phone buzzed again, louder now in the quiet, and I finally pulled it out, bracing myself for what I already knew I would see: headlines, photos, speculation turning into certainty. And there it was, front page. Multiple sources, all saying the same thing in slightly different ways, confirming what we had just performed as if it had always been true. And I stared at it longer than I should have, because there was no separation anymore, no space to argue against it. The narrative had locked into place. "You should not read those right now," Nathan said, his voice closer than I expected, and I realized he had stepped nearer without me noticing, his presence cutting through the noise in my head. "I am part of those now," I replied quietly, not looking up from the screen, and there was a pause, not long, but enough to register, enough to feel intentional. Then he said, "You are part of this," and that distinction should not have mattered, but it did. It shifted the weight of everything again, because one felt passive, like something happening to me, and the other felt active, like something I was inside, contributing to, shaping even in small ways. I finally looked up at him, searching for something. I was not even sure what. Maybe a crack in the control, maybe a sign that this was still just strategy, still just calculated. But his expression was the same as always, composed, unreadable. Except for one small detail, his gaze did not move away immediately. It held, just for a second longer than necessary. And that second stretched, not uncomfortable, not intense, just there, like something unspoken had settled between us, and I broke it first, because holding it felt like stepping into something I was not ready for. "What happens now?" I asked, and he answered without hesitation, like he had been waiting for that question. "Now we make it consistent," and I almost laughed at that. Because of course we did. Of course this was not a one-time performance, not a single event. This was something ongoing, something that would need to be maintained, reinforced, lived, and the idea of that settled into me slowly, heavier with each second, because consistency meant repetition, and repetition meant habit, and habit meant something far more dangerous than a single decision. It meant change, and as we walked again, moving back toward his office like this was just another step in a process he had already mastered, I realized that the real risk was not that people would believe this was real. It was that at some point, without noticing exactly when, I might start to believe it too. Consistency turned out to be a lot more invasive than I expected, because it did not stop at one press conference or a few headlines. It followed me into the next morning, into my inbox, into the way people looked at me when I walked into the office, like I had crossed into a version of myself they were only just discovering. And I could feel it in the small pauses, the double takes, the way conversations shifted when I got too close, not hostile, not even judgmental, just aware in a way that made everything feel slightly off balance. And I told myself this was temporary, that this was part of the plan, something structured, controlled, something Nathan would eventually resolve the same way he resolved everything else. But that thought did not settle the way I wanted it to, because this did not feel like something that would simply end. It felt like something that was already taking root. "Ethan," a voice called from behind me, and I turned to see someone from management I barely interacted with before now looking at me like I was suddenly relevant, like proximity had changed my value overnight. "Nathan is expecting you upstairs." And there it was again, that subtle shift, not an invitation, not a request, just an assumption that I would go, that I belonged there now. And I hated how quickly my body responded, how naturally I adjusted course toward the elevator without arguing, without questioning it, like I had already accepted the role that had been assigned to me. The ride up felt different this time, less uncertain, more focused, like my mind had started organizing the chaos into something manageable, something I could move through without freezing. And when the doors opened, I did not hesitate. I stepped out, crossed the space, knocked once, and entered before I could overthink it. He was already there. Of course he was, standing by the window with the city stretching out behind him like it belonged to him. And for a second I just watched him, because it was easier than acknowledging the way my life had started orbiting his in ways I did not fully understand. "You are early," he said without turning, and I almost pointed out that I had been told to come up, that this was not me choosing anything. But the words did not feel necessary, so instead I said, I did not want to be late, and that earned a small shift in his posture, subtle but noticeable, like he had registered something in that answer, something I had not meant to reveal, because it sounded less like obligation and more like intention, and that unsettled me more than anything else so far. He turned then, his expression the same controlled calm as always, but there was something in his eyes that lingered a second longer than usual, like he was reassessing, adjusting, recalibrating based on something I had not even realized I was giving him. "The schedule has been updated," he said, moving past it as if the moment had not happened. "Interviews, appearances, controlled visibility." I nodded, because of course it had. Of course this was not slowing down. If anything, it was expanding, becoming more detailed, more structured, and I should have felt overwhelmed. I should have pushed back, but instead I found myself asking, "What do you need me to do?" And the second the words left my mouth, I felt it, that shift again, subtle but undeniable, because that was not resistance, that was alignment. And Nathan paused, just for a fraction of a second, like he had not expected that phrasing, like he had anticipated hesitation, negotiation, something more defensive, but not this. Not cooperation delivered so easily. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more precise. "Stay consistent." And I nodded again, because I understood what that meant now. Not just actions, not just appearances, but behavior, tone, presence. Everything had to match the story we had started. Everything had to reinforce it until it became indistinguishable from reality. And as I stood there, absorbing that, I realized something that settled deeper than I wanted to admit. This was no longer about being pulled into his plan. It was about maintaining it. And maintaining it required something I had not expected to give. Not just effort, but belief, even if it was only partial, even if it was only surface level. And that was where the real danger lived, because belief had a way of growing, of expanding quietly until it filled spaces you did not intend to give it. And as I met his gaze again, steady, controlled, and yet somehow more attentive than before, I could not tell if he had noticed that shift in me, or if he had been waiting for it all along. The shift did not happen all at once. It was smaller than that, quieter, something that slipped in between routines and expectations. Until I could not pinpoint the exact moment it started, but I felt it during the interview later that afternoon when the host leaned forward with a knowing smile and asked how we met. And I should have deferred, should have let Nathan handle it the way he handled everything else. But instead I answered, not with the rehearsed version, not exactly, but with something close enough to pass, something that sounded real because parts of it were. And I caught the way Nathan's gaze flicked toward me, brief but sharp, like he was recalculating again, adjusting the parameters of something I did not fully understand. And the interview moved on, smooth, controlled, successful by every visible metric. But something about that moment stayed with me, something that felt less like following a script and more like writing lines into it. And I did not know if that was a mistake or a progression. Afterward, we stepped into a quieter space, away from the lights, away from the curated version of ourselves we had just presented, and I expected him to correct me, to point out where I had deviated, where I had risked the structure he built so carefully. But instead he said, "You adapted," and I blinked at that because it was not criticism, it was recognition, and that unsettled me more than anything else. "I was not trying to adapt," I said, but the words felt weak even as I spoke them, because part of me knew that was not entirely true. Part of me had adjusted instinctively, without asking permission, without checking boundaries, and that part was growing, quietly but steadily, and Nathan did not argue, he simply observed, which is exactly why it worked. And there it was again, that subtle reinforcement, that quiet validation that made this feel less like a role and more like a function I was fulfilling. And I should have pushed back, should have drawn a line somewhere. But instead I found myself asking, what happens if I say something wrong? And he studied me for a moment, longer than usual, like he was deciding how much to reveal. Then he answered, "Then we adjust." And the simplicity of that response did something unexpected. It removed the fear of making mistakes, replaced it with something else, something more fluid, more adaptable. And that was dangerous, because it meant there were no fixed boundaries, no clear limits, just a continuous process of shaping and reshaping until the outcome matched the intention. And I realized then that this was not just about maintaining a story, it was about evolving it. And evolving it required input, required participation, required me in ways that went beyond standing beside him and repeating what was necessary. Later that evening, when we returned to his office, the city lights reflecting off the glass in a way that made everything feel suspended, like time had slowed just enough for me to catch up to the reality I was living in, I found myself watching him again, the way he moved, the way he handled everything with that same controlled precision. And for the first time I noticed something I had not before, not in his actions, but in the spaces between them, the brief pauses, the moments where his attention lingered just slightly longer than needed. And I wondered, not for the first time, how much of this was still strategy and how much of it had shifted into something else, something less defined, because the narrative we were building was no longer static. It was responding, adjusting, growing with every interaction, and so was I. And that realization settled in quietly, heavier than anything that had come before, because it meant that at some point, without a clear marker or a deliberate choice, I had stopped being just part of the plan and started becoming part of the outcome. And I did not know if that was exactly what he intended, or if it was something neither of us had accounted for. It did not feel like a breaking point when it happened, which somehow made it worse, because I always thought moments like that would be obvious, loud, impossible to miss. But instead it came quietly, buried inside something as simple as a late-night message that should not have mattered as much as it did, my phone lighting up well past midnight with his name, not a command, not an instruction, just a single line asking if I was still awake. And I stared at it longer than I should have, because that was new. That was not part of the structure, not part of the schedule, not something that fit neatly into the narrative we had been building. And I told myself it was still strategy, still calculated. Maybe another layer I had not fully understood yet, but that explanation did not settle the way it used to, because there was no audience here, no cameras, no one to influence, just me and a message that did not need to exist. I typed back before I could overthink it. Yes, and the reply came almost immediately, which should not have surprised me but did. Come upstairs, and that was it. No context, no explanation, just expectation, and for a second I considered ignoring it, considered pretending I had not seen it, because that would have been the smarter choice, the safer one, the one that kept things defined and contained. But instead I found myself moving, already grabbing my jacket, already stepping out into the hallway before I could talk myself out of it. And the realization that I was choosing this, not being directed, not being pulled, choosing, settled into me with a weight I could not ignore. The building was quieter at this hour, the polished surfaces reflecting a softer version of the space I had been navigating all day. And when I reached his floor, there was no hesitation. I knocked once and the door opened almost immediately, like he had been waiting right there, just on the other side. His expression the same controlled calm as always, but something about the timing made it feel different, less coincidental, more intentional. "You are here," he said, and it was not a question, not even acknowledgement, just a statement that carried something under it I could not quite name. "You asked me to come," I replied, keeping my voice even. But there was a slight edge to it now, something sharper, because this felt different, and he stepped aside without another word, letting me in. The office looked the same, everything in its place, everything controlled, except for one detail. The jacket draped over the back of his chair, the loosened tie, small signs that the structure had shifted just enough to reveal something underneath. And that made me more aware than anything else, because it meant this moment was not entirely constructed, not entirely planned. Or if it was a version I had not seen before. I stayed near the door at first, creating space, maintaining something I could still call distance. "Why am I here?" I asked, direct, because I needed clarity before I stepped any further into whatever this was becoming. And he watched me for a second, longer than necessary, like he was deciding how to answer, or how much to reveal. Then he said, "Because you are part of this now." And the words landed differently here, without the noise, without the pressure of an audience. They felt less like a statement of fact, and more like something else, something closer to inclusion, or maybe expectation, and I shook my head slightly, not fully rejecting it, but not accepting it either. "That does not answer my question," I said. And for the first time since this started, there was a pause that felt unstructured, not calculated, just there, real. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter, stripped of the usual precision. "I wanted to see you." And the simplicity of that hit harder than anything else today, because it did not fit into the plan, it did not align with the strategy, it did not serve the narrative, it just existed. And I stood there, caught between stepping forward and stepping back, because if this was still part of the arrangement, then I could handle it. I could categorize it, keep it contained. But if it was not, if it was something outside of that, something unscripted, then I did not know where that left me, or him, or whatever this had become. And the silence stretched between us, not uncomfortable, not forced, just heavy with everything we were not saying. And for the first time since all of this started, I realized that the most dangerous part of this was not the public story we were maintaining. It was whatever was happening here, in the spaces where no one else was watching, because that was where the lines blurred the fastest. And I did not know if either of us was trying to stop it anymore. The silence did not break the way I expected it to. There was no sudden shift back into structure, no immediate return to the controlled version of him I had learned to navigate. Instead, it lingered, stretching just long enough to feel real. And that made everything sharper, more exposed, because without the script, without the clear boundaries of what this was supposed to be, I did not know where to stand, or what I was supposed to be to him in this moment. And that uncertainty settled in deeper than anything the cameras or headlines had done. because those had rules. Those had purpose. This did not. You wanted to see me, I repeated slowly, testing the words, trying to understand where they fit, and his gaze did not waver, did not retreat. No, he said quietly, and that one word carried more weight than I was prepared for. Because it removed the distance I had been relying on, it stripped away the assumption that everything between us was still part of the arrangement, and I felt something shift in my chest, something that was not entirely comfortable, but not something I wanted to step away from either. That is not part of the plan, I said, more to ground myself than to challenge him, and for a second I thought he might correct me, might pull us back into that familiar structure, but instead he shook his head. Slightly. Not everything is. And the way he said it felt like an admission, not a weakness, but a recognition that even he could not fully control where this was going anymore. And that realization should have been enough to make me step back, to reestablish the distance I had been slowly losing. But instead I stayed where I was, caught in that space between logic and something else I was not ready to name. You built this, I said, my voice quieter now, less defensive, more certain you planned. Every part of it, every move, every outcome. And he did not deny it. He did not even interrupt. He just listened, which somehow made it harder to hold on to the argument. But this, I continued, gesturing vaguely between us. This was not supposed to be part of it. And there it was, the line I had been trying to draw, the separation I needed to believe still existed. And for a moment he did not respond. His expression unreadable, but not distant, not cold, just focused in a way that made it feel like he was actually considering the weight of what I was saying instead of dismissing it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something under it now, something less precise. You are right. And that was not what I expected, not agreement, not acknowledgement. Because if he admitted that, then it meant this was something else, something outside the boundaries we had defined, and that made it harder to categorize, harder to control, harder to walk away from. Then why? I asked, the question slipping out before I could filter it. Because if this was not part of the plan, if this was not necessary, then there had to be a reason, something that explained why he had blurred the line instead of reinforcing it. And he looked at me then, really looked, not assessing, not calculating, just present in a way I had not seen before. And for the first time since this started, there was a pause that felt uncertain, not because he did not know what to say, but because he was choosing how much to reveal. And when he finally answered, it was quieter than anything he had said before, because I stopped wanting it to be just that, and the words settled between us with a weight that made everything else feel distant. The plan, the contract, the narrative, all of it suddenly less defined, less certain, because this changed the foundation of it. This turned something controlled into something unpredictable, and I stood there, trying to process it, trying to understand what it meant for everything we had built so far. Because if he no longer wanted this to be just a strategy, then where did that leave me? And more importantly, where did that leave us? And the answer did not come immediately. It did not come clearly. It just lingered in the space between us, unresolved, unfinished, like something that was still forming. And I realized then that the real problem was not whether this had gone off script. It was that neither of us seemed willing to pull it back. And that made whatever came next something we could not predict, something we could not fully control. And for the first time since all of this started, that uncertainty did not feel like a threat. It felt like a question neither of us was ready to answer. The space between us did not close, but it changed, like something invisible had shifted the air itself, making every second feel heavier, more deliberate. And I realized that for the first time since this started, there was no clear direction, no next step already waiting to be executed, just a quiet uncertainty that neither of us was rushing to resolve. And that was new, because everything about Nathan Cole had always been precise, controlled, intentional. And now there was something else mixed into it, something that did not follow the same rules, something that did not need an audience to exist. You stopped wanting it to be just that, I repeated. Slowly, the words still settling into place, still trying to find where they fit inside everything else we had built. And he did not correct me, did not reframe it into something safer. He just held my gaze like he was letting me see the truth of it without filtering it through strategy. And that should have made this easier, should have clarified something. But instead it complicated everything. Because if this was no longer just a plan, then it was something I had to choose, not once, not with a signature on a contract, but continuously, In moments like this, in decisions that did not have clear boundaries or instructions, and I felt that weight settle in, steady and unavoidable. You know this changes things, I said, my voice quieter now, not defensive, just certain, because there was no going back to what this was before, no clean reset to something simpler. And he nodded once, not dismissing it, not minimizing it, just acknowledging the truth of it in a way that felt almost grounding. I know, he replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to soften the impact, just acceptance, and that should have reassured me. But it did not, because acceptance meant he was not trying to fix it, not trying to pull it back into something controlled. It meant he was willing to let it evolve into something neither of us had planned, and that was where the real risk lived. Not in the headlines or the expectations, but here, in the quiet, where there were no guidelines to follow, no structure to rely on, just instinct. And instinct was unpredictable in ways neither of us could fully manage. I took a step forward without fully deciding to, closing some of the distance but not all of it, enough to feel the shift, enough to acknowledge that I was no longer standing at the edge of this. I was already inside it, and I did not know if that made me reckless or just honest. We built something people believe in, I said, not looking away from him, because that part was still true, still solid, still something we could define. And he nodded again, his expression steady. We did, he agreed, and there was no doubt in it, no hesitation, just confirmation, and I exhaled slowly. Because that part was still safe, still something we could control. But then I added, and now it is not just them. And the words lingered between us, heavier than anything else I had said, because they pointed to something we had both been avoiding naming directly. And this time he did not respond immediately, the pause stretching just long enough to feel intentional, to feel like he was choosing his next words carefully, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood what they meant. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but steady. Then we decide what it becomes, and that was it. No guarantee, no promise, no attempt to define it beyond that, just a statement that placed the choice back in both of our hands. And I realized then that this was the first time since all of this started that I was not being pulled into something. I was being asked to step into it willingly, and that difference mattered more than anything else, because it meant I could walk away. Technically, I could draw a line and go back to something simpler, something safer, something that did not blur into something real without permission. But I did not move. I did not step back. I just stood there, meeting his gaze, feeling the weight of that choice settle into something steady instead of overwhelming. And for a moment neither of us said anything else, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to structure, just the understanding that whatever came next would not be part of a plan. It would be something we created in real time. And that was the most unpredictable part of all, because for the first time, Nathan Cole was not the only one shaping the outcome. And as that realization settled in, quiet but undeniable, I understood that this was no longer about surviving his world or fitting into his narrative. It was about whether I was willing to stay in it when it stopped being controlled, when it stopped being safe, when it started becoming something real. And as the silence stretched between us again, not empty but full of everything we had not said, I realized I already knew my answer, even if I had not spoken it out loud yet.